Hey guys, I was just thinking and reflecting on the class we had last night. There was a couple of loose ends that I really felt needed to kind of be tied up, what I didn't forget. And then one of those things really was that we didn't read the text enough last night when we were talking about Aristotle and pleasure and things like that. Sort of got carried away in our conversation, and I didn't go back to the text. And so there's some key points I kind of want to make out of the text here. And so last night we had seen that Aristotle critiqued a notion of pleasure, and I think it's just not an uncommon notion of pleasure, that pleasure is some sensation that's completely separable from the acts that we do. And so that when you ride your bike, or when you eat a sandwich, and when you read a book, they're all sources of pleasure, and that pleasure is one and the same, just from different kinds of sources. Well, Aristotle says that that's wrong. That, in fact, pleasure can't be separable from these activities, and the evidence of that is the way that we live, that to ride a bike is not the same kind of activity and not the same kind of pleasure as eating a sandwich. You know, if you want to ride a bike, you don't want to eat a sandwich. And there's no eating sandwiches, enough of any type of sandwich that will ever give you the pleasure, the proper pleasure of riding your bike. You want to enjoy riding your bike, you got to ride your bike. And so just to look at a couple texts here, Aristotle says this. He says, if you go to book 10, chapter 3, Aristotle, book 10, chapter 3, you see Aristotle making some interesting distinctions. So on page 278, Aristotle writes, one might retort that pleasures are different in kind. There is a difference between pleasures that come from noble sources and pleasures that come from base sources, and the pleasure of a just man can't possibly be felt by someone who is not just, nor the pleasure of music by someone who is not musical, and so forth. What he's saying is that you don't know what those pleasures are. You haven't experienced the pleasure of a musical performance and being musical unless you are a musical person, unless you're someone who's actively done those activities. What does this mean for us? Well, when we looked at the big picture of this question of whether the best life is a life of pleasure, the issue was that how that pleasure is united to the ends of a person living the kind of best life, and how we conceive of pleasure. This is the problem. When Aristotle initially critiques pleasure, he's saying that many people conceive of pleasure purely in terms of some sensation that they're after. And so actually, if we go up to book 7, chapter 13, page 209, a little bit down the page here, Aristotle says, but the bodily pleasures have arrogated the name pleasure unto themselves as their own private possession, because everyone tends to follow them and participates in them more frequently than any others. Accordingly, these are the only pleasures with which they are familiar. People think they are the only ones that exist. Okay? Most of us, all of us, know the pleasures of food and drink and maybe even sex, right? And those things are obvious. Those things are obviously good, and all people kind of know about them. And so when you use the word pleasure, we tend to think of those things first. Now, for Aristotle, that can be a big problem because, in fact, while those are pleasures, those are particular kinds of pleasures. And, in fact, they're actually pretty similar pleasures. When it comes to eating, drinking, every time you eat and drink, that activity of eating and drinking is going to give you similar kinds of pleasures because they're similar kinds of activities. Not that eating and drinking is like sex, but even that, in terms of the physical sensations related to it, there is in many ways how it's kind of related. The most important pleasures, in fact, the pleasures of the person who's living the best life, are not necessarily those pleasures that are common to all people, that are obvious, because they're different. You have to become the kind of person to enjoy them. Just in the same kind of way that you have to become the right kind of person to, say, enjoy scotch, which I think is disgusting. But some people, they like, or say a fine wine. You might meet someone who is a sommelier or someone who really enjoys high quality wine. That's not me. I don't know about that kind of thing. But you have to be the right kind of person to kind of enjoy that, right? Well, some of the highest kinds of pleasures, which essentially are the highest kinds of activities, you need to become the kind of person to actually enjoy them, and until you've become that kind of person and done those activities, you'll never know those kinds of pleasures. And so this is a final kind of note. When we think of the relationship between pleasure and activity, pleasure and happiness, Aristotle will not say that the life of pleasure is happiness, because it's misunderstood. In fact, the person who's living the good life, the happy life, isn't seeking after pleasure in whatever way they can find and just the best pleasures that are out there. No, the happy person is someone who enjoys the most excellent activities. They take pleasure in doing the most excellent kind of things. Their aim isn't pleasure, but to enjoy the best kinds of ways of living, right? And the best ways of living is something that we'll investigate next class. That what's included in the best life. What are the best activities of a human being? What kind of activities bring out what's best in us? What are the highest aims, the highest goods that we can achieve through our human actions? So I hope that clarifies things. We read a couple texts, but really, in terms of pleasure, you're looking in Book 7, the end of Book 7, the beginning of Book 10. You'll kind of get a lot of good stuff there. All right.